So this whole page gives us a chance to practice the AC test on these trinomials. And so the signs are kind of all mixed up. We're going to use our little number puzzle, that idea that the A coefficient times the C coefficient gives you the number at the top of your number puzzle. And we're going to factor that as many ways as we can. And then take a look at the signs. So these could all be positive factors or all be negative factors. The B term is negative, so that makes me think that all of these are going to be negative. And so that would bring me to believe that this -3, -8 are the numbers that are going to help me decompose my middle term because they add together to give me -11. So I rewrite my polynomial decomposing my middle term. I'm going to factor by grouping. Slowing it down and looking at the first two terms first, I see that they have an x in common, and factoring that out would give me an x and a -3. Then I look at the other two terms and I take a look and decide what they have in common. And I would see that they have a -8 in common. That sign is a negative, so I go with that as the sign on my common factor, same as I've done all the way through. Factoring a -8 out of each of these terms and writing what's left over in the brackets, I'd be left with an x and a -3. And this is always a good sign when those brackets match because that bracket is now my common factor. So I write it down, I put down the brackets, and I put what's left over when I divide that common factor out of each of the terms. So I'd be left with an x and I'd be left with a -8. I'm going to talk through all of these. You're welcome to work through them on your own. I'm going to show you the AC test and the number puzzle. At the end of this page, I have a surprise for you, so don't fast forward through the end. You might find the surprise at some point before I get there. For B, I have 1 times -20, so -20 is going to go at the top of my number puzzle. I'm going to factor it in as many ways as I can. I always concern myself with the signs after. I see that I have a -20 at the top, so that means I have one factor being positive and one factor being negative. I see that I have a negative B term, so that means that the sum of these, the big terms have to be negative and the littler terms, or so the littler factors, I should say, are going to be positive. And so that leads me to the solution here that +4 and -5 are going to be what satisfies my number puzzle or my AC test. So they're also the numbers that are going to decompose that middle term. So I rewrite it using those. And then I factor by grouping. I look at the common factor, the first two terms, and factor it out. Then I look at the second two terms and find the common factor and factor it out. After I'm done that, I should have a common binomial factor. And factoring that out, I'm left with my second binomial. These can always be checked. Go back to the original question. And really, once you have the number puzzle, you're most of the way there. Just going to scroll down and do the next ones. So for C, at the top of my number puzzle, I'd have 1 times +33, so +33. Sometimes people can guess ahead on the factors. I like to factor it as many ways as possible and then work from there. I see that I have a positive B term and a positive number here, so that means everything's going to be positive. And +3 and +11 are what add together to give me my B term. So they're the numbers that are going to decompose my middle term. I'm going to factor by grouping. Pulling a B out of the first two terms, I'm left with a B plus 3 in the brackets. Looking at the second two terms, I can see that I have a +11 as my greatest common factor, and factoring that out, writing in the brackets a B plus 3. Now the b plus 3 is my greatest common factor, and factoring that out, I'd be left with a b plus 11. Moving on, D, I have 1 times a positive 60, so it's positive 60 at the top of my number puzzle. 60 is one of these numbers that's a pain in the butt. There are so many factors of 60. So take it slow. Hopefully I won't miss any. I usually mess this up. So those would be all my factors. I've got a positive 60, so they're either all positive or they're all negative. I look at my B term and it's negative 17, so that means that they're all going to be negative. So this allows me then to check which combination of factors would actually add together to give me negative 17. So negative 5 and negative 12 would add together to give me negative 17. They're the numbers that are going to decompose my middle term. So I rewrite it. So I can factor by grouping on the 4 terms. I take a look at the first 2 terms and factor it out. I take a look at the second 2 terms and factor them. Then I have that binomial factor in common, so x minus 5. And factoring that out, filling up the brackets, when I divide it out, I'd be left with an x minus 12. A few more here. You may be finding a shortcut. If you're watching the video, you can throw the shortcut in the chat, and if not, I will tell you at the end. So E, we've got 1 times negative 18, so negative 18 at the top of the number puzzle. If I factor this as many ways as I can, coming back to think about signs as a secondary thing, I've got negative 18 at the top, so that's that mismatch of signs on my factors. I have a positive B term, so that means that the big ones are positive and the little ones are negative. So that allows me then to kind of select which combinations of factors finish up my number puzzle here, which satisfy that second criteria of the AC test. So I decompose my middle term with those values. I've got it expanded to the 4 terms, so then I divide it up and factor by grouping. Oops, I made a sign error there. Something was going wrong. Okay. And I get it into factored form. F, I'd have 1 times 25, so 25, a positive 25 at the top of my number puzzle. Factor it in as many ways as I can. Look at my B term is positive, so that means all my factors are going to be positive, and it's 5 plus 5 that add together to give me a positive 10. So I'm going to decompose that middle term. I'm going to factor by grouping. I pull out my common factor of that binomial, and then in the second bracket, I put what's left behind. I get a plus 5 and a plus 5. Now you could say that that's a plus 5 squared. That's the same answer. One more here. I've got 1 times 1, so positive 1 is going to be at the top of my number puzzle. I can factor it only in one way, and at this point, I take a look, my middle term is going to be negative, so it'd be negative and negative, but all of a sudden I only have one option, and it does not add to get to the B term. So I put this one in here because this can happen. So this one is unfactorable with our skills, and it fails the AC test. And so just to know that that does sometimes happen, um, it's worthwhile putting the oddballs in on that one. They don't take a lot of time, but just to know that you can have the confidence so you know what you're looking for in this AC test and you have a strategy to factor. So now comes the kicker, the question, is there a shortcut? Can anybody see the shortcut that's going on? If I just look at the ones that are up here, take a look at the numbers that you circled in your AC test. When you were done the AC test, you were technically done these questions because the numbers from your AC test are the numbers that are in your binomials in your answer. Now, you might think, well, if there was a shortcut all along, why would I have taught you the long cut? And the reason why is that 4.3, the one that we do next, is ax squared plus bx plus c. And in all of those, we have a coefficient that is not 1. And so when there's a not 1 here, you cannot do the shortcut. So the way I teach this is what I call the long cut because it works every time. So it always works. And so the long cut always works, which is why I teach you the long cut. So the next section is more of the same, which should reinforce our strategies as we continue to move through our factoring unit.